Two and a Half Admins, episode 250. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Allan.
And here we are again for the 250th time. But we don't care because it's not 256, do we?
Correct.
Something like that.
Yeah, maybe we'll do something in 6 episodes. We'll have to see. Anyway, before we get started, your customary article plug, Allan, is the overlooked complexity of firmware security in the IoT era.
Yeah, and so in this article, we talk about how you can build a secure platform for IoT and what some of the components of that can be, going beyond just, secure boot to make sure that your firmware is loading the correct operating system, but all the way through that operating system has each of its components verified. And just some of the places people tend to overlook when building firmware and in designing update mechanisms for that firmware to make sure that rogue firmware can't get loaded on the device and make it unrecoverable.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. Google Chrome to distrust 2 certificate authorities over compliance and conduct issues.
Google is going to distrust Chunghwa Telecom from Taiwan and NetLock from Hungary because it says there have been an ongoing pattern of compliance failures, unmet improvement commitments, and an absence of tangible, measurable progress in response to publicly disclosed incident reports.
Which sounds pretty reasonable to me, right?
Yes.
And so I said, well, why are we going to cover this? This is just fair enough. But then you pointed out.
Yeah. So normally the list of what certificate authorities are trusted is managed by a group called the CA/B, which is the Certificate Authority Browser Alliance. And they set out the rules for how long certificates are allowed to be valid for, what steps certificate authorities have to take to prove their compliance, and so on. And they're supposed to have the kind of dispute resolution methodology to deal with this type of problem. But Google is kind of going around that and unilaterally just deleting these 2 from their certificate trust list. But that means it seems so far, are not removed from Apple and Mozilla and Microsoft's trust root. And my question is, why is that? Is it that Google's feeling that CAB is being too slow and not yanking these certificates when they should be? Or is it Google just going around the CAB and ignoring it? What in the process has broken down, and how do we make sure we can continue to trust the list of root certificate authorities?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought this is not the first time Google has done this. I believe that Chrome also pulled trust for the Symantec CA back when they were at the height of their shenanigans before anybody else did.
Yes, and they're not the only one. I think Apple also previously pulled somebody else's certificate at a previous time. And so there's precedence for this. It's not the first time it's ever been done, but I would just wonder if we will ever find out why it's not going through the normal process. For example, back in November, collectively, Google, Apple, and Mozilla decided to no longer trust Entrust and pulled their thing out of the root trust, and Entrust ended up selling its whole business to Sectigo because, when not trusted by any browsers, you don't have a certificate authority business anymore.
And did they do that properly, or did they just do that unilaterally without the CAB?
It sounds like it was coordinated because it included Apple and Mozilla, but it's not clear if it went through the CAB or not.
It sounds to me like Google just wants to completely sideline the CAB.
I think Google has a long history of being well aware of when it's the 900-pound gorilla in the room and acting accordingly. I don't have any special insight, into the decision-making process. I can't look at people's emails or anything, but it doesn't seem hard at all for me to believe that, Google feels like it's got big boy pants enough to just decide to stop trusting whatever it feels like it's going to stop trusting, and by God, the world will adapt.
Yeah, but they're not completely dropping out, because earlier this year in March, Google revealed that via an effort they were pushing via the CA/browser forum, they would adopt the multi-perspective issuance corroboration and linting practices and basically beef up the baseline requirements that all certificate authorities have to follow to enhance the domain control validated and flag any insecure practices in X509 certificates. So they're still participating in the CAB and helping to ratchet up the baseline requirements, but then it seems like something at the CAB isn't working, and the browser manufacturers are sometimes distrusting stuff outside of the established regime. And so I'm just curious where it's breaking down and if it's Google just jumping the gun or the process being too slow or something actually being broken somewhere.
I mean, there's no reason to stop being a member of the board. It gives you some leverage over the other folks who are members. If you can just unilaterally distrust a CA for yourself whenever you feel like it, which clearly they can, what's the point in formally not being on that board or a part of that community? You get all of the goodies on both sides that way. You do whatever you want, and also you show up and tell everybody else what to do. If it's not clear, I'm not trying to paint Google as glaringly evil here. I mean, they kind of are, but in this context, I'm not trying to make a point of Google being evil. I'm just saying, if you are Google and you are aware of your browser market share, it might seem incredibly reasonable to just say, hey, yeah, we're members of this board, and we'll tell the board, you know what, we're distrusting this crap, and y'all ought to as well, but do you really feel like you need to wait before you revoke the trust in your own browser? And I think if you're Google, you don't feel like you need to.
Correct. And they're not actually going to revoke it until July 31st. This might just be the final warning to these certificate authorities to get in shape. I guess my question is, why is the CAB not also on top of this? Are they being too lax about, the missed promises to get up into spec for these certificate authorities? The CAB is a bit of, as where it comes from the name, it's an alliance between the certificate authorities and the browsers. And so are they just leaning on the certificate authority side too much in their decision? Are they just being too lax? Is there a reason why this is being distrusted only in Google and not also Apple and Mozilla? Is something in the process breaking down? I'm not saying it's not right for Google to do this. I'm saying it's a sign that possibly something at the CAB isn't working, and maybe we can look at fixing that and making sure that if these CAs shouldn't be trusted, they shouldn't be trusted by anyone instead of being half trusted and half not.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of us, if not most of us in the industry at least, who are aware enough of authentication issues that, ultimately the trust has to go up to a certification authority and what that actually means. I think a lot of us are probably not real happy with the state of security with that because, we keep having rogue CAs over and over and over again. And, you only see so many of these go by before you start asking, okay, why are we ever allowing, Bob's collection of dipshits in Lithuania to be a CA that can, in theory, even declare that it can give you a certificate that's valid for Google.com? The whole system is a little too... It reminds me too much of, the era when email was designed, when, there's this unchallenged tech bro idea that just everything on the internet will just be us techie folk who want to be helpful and do the right thing and make sure all the packets get where they need to go. And there's not really any provision that's been made for okay, but there's commercial interest here, and commercial interest is always going to draw bad actors, and we need to partition and segment. And, I don't feel like we ever really got a very good security and privacy design in the certificate system.
Yeah, it's just the CAB is enforcing these baseline requirements, and those continue to be ratcheted up. We saw that Apple's pushing for the CAB to actually limit every certificate to be, 45 days at most, rather than years at a time. And I think that probably makes sense in a lot of cases. But what's the point of having a baseline requirement if certificate authorities can be out of compliance with that for months and months at a time, and it's not resulting in them getting distrusted?
Well, that's very likely a funding issue, isn't it? I mean, who's paying for that to happen?
Well, it's supposed to be the certificate authorities and the browsers.
Oh, the certificate authorities are paying for the certificate authorities to be audited regularly and make sure they're in compliance, huh? Mm-hmm. I don't see any issues there.
Yandex and Meta's mobile apps were doing a bit of naughty tracking on Android.
Yeah, so this one's kind of interesting. So if you have one of the Meta apps on your phone on Android, it might be listening on localhost on a certain port. And then if you go to websites that have Meta's Pixel script or something running on that website, that script would then try to connect out to localhost on that port. And in doing so, could basically tell the app that you're doing stuff in your browser and give them more and more information, and also connect the kind of cookie of, hey, this person's on this website, back to the login that the app on your phone has. So even if you are, you have the Facebook app or whatever on your phone, and then in even a private browsing session or an incognito session or whatever on your phone, you're going to another website that has a Facebook pixel, it would be able to connect those two identities together, even though they're not supposed to be able to.
This sounds an awful lot like just a bulletproof way to store whatever cookies you want without ever triggering a cookie warning, because you're not actually using cookies and the browser doesn't quite know about it. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but like what I'm hearing here is we're running a web server bound to localhost only. And on some web pages, a piece of JavaScript will run that will then connect. Your phone connects to itself on localhost to the web server locally, bound only to localhost, that's running the silly little thing. Well, then you can do whatever you want, essentially. You can read and write data. That's exactly what the cookie system is supposed to be for, but nobody knows it's a cookie. And nothing in your browser designed to protect about cookies will apply.
Yeah, even if you have something like an ad blocker that might try to dumb down the JavaScript and so on, it could literally be putting a pixel, like an image tag going to a GIF with a long name that's coming from that localhost thing. And so it could be a very innocent looking, I'm just loading a picture on this website. I'm not actually running a bunch of malicious JavaScript or something. So there's a couple of different ways you could use to, pass information back and forth between the app and the browser that even an ad blocker might not actually think is an ad.
You could grab what appeared to be a CSS file and embed literally any arbitrary data you wanted in what, as far as an ad blocking tool running in your browser would think, it would just look like you were trying to load a CSS file and you happen to be loading it from a server running on localhost. Big deal. That could happen. People run servers on localhost all the time. They might want to check their own website on, the machine that is actually running the website. I have certainly connected, on localhost with like wget countless times, trying to investigate stuff. So it's not necessarily something that's going to stand out unless and until the whole industry wises up and says, hey, maybe that's a little bit of a red flag if you got a website that says, I want to connect on localhost and the other website is not running on localhost.
Yeah, and so the browsers do some stuff about that, but it's mostly about the JavaScript and not letting it trick it to do stuff. And I think, you could do basic stuff like putting the CSS file. Although I think in this particular case, the information flow is mostly the other direction. It's the browser wanting to send data to the app, but it can do that by just having a really long file name for that CSS file.
Well, we haven't covered it, but the data wouldn't necessarily need to come back directly from the app because the website has access to the entire cloud infrastructure of whoever is putting that website out there with the nasty little thing that wants to talk to your nasty little snitch on localhost. The nasty little snitch running on localhost might only be listening on localhost, but it can just talk directly out to the cloud of whoever's running the thing.
Is this not just an inevitable escalation in the arms race of privacy?
That's exactly what it is. That's why I hound dogged in on the cookie bypass thing so quick, is because that's essentially what this thing is for. It's for doing the exact same thing cookies did before the industry started, getting hardcore and regulating and limiting the ways cookies were used. When you saw Firefox, bring in like their total tracking protection. And that put a lot of pressure on everybody in the game to start saying, okay, hey, we need to find ways to firewall these cookies off and to make it less easy for all this nasty stuff to happen, to where basically anybody can make your computer snitch on anything you've ever done. Well, running this server on localhost it's a way to do the exact same thing, but not call it a cookie and not have it fall afoul of any of the existing things that keep you from doing whatever arbitrary data stealing thing you want to do using cookies. Because now in this case, your browser is actually not going to read that data and send it back, which is the way it worked with a proper cookie. A cookie is just a text file stored on your computer, and a remote website can say, hey, do you have a cookie by this name? And your browser checks and says, yeah, I sure do. And the website says, hey, can I have that cookie? And if the cookie belongs to that website, the browser says, yes. And you can move data between sites using, third-party cookies. But again, recently we had the industry crack down on this when it became clear just how invasive and how far-reaching the tracking tools and the advertising ID stuff and everything else from Amazon and from Meta and from you name it, anybody with an advertising business. So the cookies got regulated. Well, now we're right back again to no regulation. You send whatever data you want to the Snitch app, and the Snitch app just connects out to the cloud and says, here's what I know about this sucker.
So this is something that Mozilla should jump straight on and lead the industry with. They should crack down on this and be the mobile browser that doesn't allow this bullshit.
I would agree with that entirely, especially on mobile devices that have more limited use cases. It seems a little easier to have more draconian rules about what you are and are not allowed to do on localhost. Literally just telling Firefox it's not allowed to talk to localhost would instantly kill this idea, dead in its tracks. What would you lose from that? Possibly a few things, but it might be worth at that point saying, well, those other things need to figure out a different way to function because this is just too exploitable. It's too easy to abuse.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. Introducing ZFS AnyRAID, sponsored by Eshtec. This is a post from HexOS, and this sounds like quite an interesting feature coming to ZFS at some point soon. And reading this post, I see just this week, Clara Inc. announced the details of this project on the ZFS leadership call. That's you, Allan.
Yeah. So the HexOS people reached out to us, and together we kind of came up with a design for the AnyRAID feature and are in the process of implementing phase 1 of it, which is the kind of mirror-style AnyRAID. So this is something we've heard people ask for in ZFS all the time. I have a bunch of not the same size disks that I would like to mix together in a way where I still have some redundancy, but I actually get more usable space. And so, if you mix together like a 4 terabyte, 2 6 terabytes, and an 8 terabyte disk, normally in ZFS, if you did that as mirrors or RAIDz, you'd get for each VDEV the smallest disk times the number of disks. But with AnyRAID, we're actually going to be able to get not all of the usable space, but a lot more of it. So, in that example configuration, if you were just using mirrors, you'd only get 10 terabytes of usable space. But with AnyRAID mirrors, you'd actually get 12 terabytes of usable space. And then the same thing, if you made a RAIDz1 out of those 4 disks, you'd have 12 terabytes of usable space, whereas an AnyRAID Z1 would give you 16 terabytes of usable space.
Well, that all sounds well and good, but why would you want to mix disk sizes? That's not a very good thing to do, is it?
It depends on the use case. In this case, it is HexOS is building a home NAS system. And so people at home don't buy disks in boxes of 18 like I do.
Fair enough. But the fact that this wasn't in ZFS from the beginning is because it's a bad idea, isn't it?
It's not really a bad idea. It's just the use case wasn't there for Sun and their enterprise customers, no. But as long as you're getting all the features of ZFS, and ZFS is aware of all the bits that are happening, right? This isn't slicing and dicing and making virtual disks and feeding those to ZFS and hiding the reality from it. As long as ZFS has all the information, it can make the right decisions to make sure that the blocks are in a place where when a disk fails, it's only going to be able to harm one of the 2 copies of the data. And that will allow it to be just as good as if all your disks were the same size, but you're more usable space.
So the AnyRAID mirror, that's just distributed redundancy, right? You're guaranteed to have 2 copies of any given block written on 2 different disks, but there's no guarantee which 2 disks that'll be?
Basically. So what we were doing is slicing your space up into what we've decided to call tiles of, say, 16 gigabytes or so. And so each range in the VDEV, the data virtual address inside ZFS, will be mapped to n different disks. So it could be 2 or 3, depending on your setup. And so, we take the first 16 gigabytes of the VDEV and say, for this tile 0, it's on disk 1 and 2, and then tile 1 will be on disk 3 and 4. But we can vary the mix of that because, disk 4 is 8 terabytes. It's the biggest disk, so it needs to take more tiles. And we have to divide the second tile of everything across the other disk to balance it out and get the most usable space possible.
Oh, you're dividing tiles up sometimes in the redundancy?
No, so the tile comes from the VDEV level. And so that'll be the first 16 gigabytes of that VDEV will then be written to 2 different disks.
Okay.
So the tile will be duplicated on 2 different disks, and the next tile will be on 2 different disks, and so on, and spread out like that.
Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. So we're implementing Butter RAID 1 in ZFS.
Kind of. It's a bit different under the hood, but in effect, yes, it is going to give you that same kind of functionality, but with all the guarantees of ZFS instead of with all the tiers of ButterFS.
Yeah, which is good. So the AnyRAID Z1, is that just going to be like a shorter stripe so that you're able to, again, like you guarantee that you'll store a full stripe across a set of the disks, but you don't necessarily know which ones, so you make it all work?
Yeah, it'll be a RAIDz with a fixed stripe size. Well, you'll be able to set the stripe size, but yeah, it'll be less than the number of disks you have, so that you can spread the bits out across disks. It also means, because we're doing the tile thing, we would keep the DVA the same. So a la RAIDz expansion and other things, we could move a tile from one disk to another disk and just update the mapping and not have to change the addresses inside ZFS.
So we're also implementing Butter RAID 5 in ZFS.
No, because Butter RAID 5 doesn't work.
Well, Butter RAID 5 isn't fully implemented. I said we're implementing Butter RAID 5, sure. Which is more than the Butter folks can say. Sorry, Butter folks, I can't resist. Okay, so the ZFS guarantees are great, assuming we pull it off, but it's worth noting that Butter on a single drive is quite reliable. It only gets shitty when you bring the RAID algorithm in. So, I mean, there is a lot for us to get right or for us to get wrong as well, clearly.
Yes, although in particular, the actual RAIDz code will be the same RAIDz code.
Yeah.
It just will have the layer of indirection underneath it. And so the RAIDz part can't really go wrong.
Oh, don't say that, Allan.
So the actual RAIDz, like the algorithm, the math part can't go wrong. The thing we have to get right is making sure that of a stripe on a RAIDz, every tile's never on the same disk. Like you don't have 2 tiles on one disk, because then if that disk goes, you've blown your RAIDz 1.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's move back to Joe's question for a second. Joe said, well, but isn't that a bad idea? And, like many things, it's a question of, what angle you're looking at this from. Now, if you're somebody who is sitting down and has the budget to go out and buy a server with 8 bays and buy 8 drives to put in it, you should absolutely be buying, the same size new drive and like planning a better type of storage than this. On the other hand, if you have 5 or 6 drives reclaimed from God knows where, and you are bound and determined to make a redundant array out of it, this is the kind of topology that you would use. This was always the promise with Butter RAID 1. And as I have mentioned several times, above and beyond Butter's software problems, it is a bit dangerous in the sense that it encourages people to think, well, I'm becoming more safe by introducing more dodgy hardware into the mix, where it usually doesn't work that way. The more points of failure you introduce, the more chances for something to break. Now, the RAID part of it, the redundancy or the parity, however distributed, that can preserve uptime. If you're incredibly lucky, sometimes it's been known to preserve somebody's data when they didn't have a backup, but that's not what it's for. Please listen to us. And it distresses me because the most of the people who are the most interested in this kind of setup that lends itself to, I can just make use of whatever garbage bag full of nonsense I managed to find, at the swap meet or whatever. Those are also the folks who are the least likely to have a proper backup system. And so it's kind of a primrose path to hell, honestly. It's not that it can't be done sanely and well. It's just that it so encourages bad practices that it kind of makes me feel a little icky.
In particular, the use case I see for this is less the I've got a grab bag of old dodgy hardware and more I've got the disks I've got now, and over time I'm going to keep expanding them, but I'm not going to be able to replace all 6 disks at once. And so I want to be able to swap out one of the disks with a new 18 terabyte drive I just bought and start getting some of that usable space now. Whereas with a traditional RAID from ZFS, you wouldn't get it until you upgraded at least a whole VDEV's worth of disk before you got any more usable space. Whereas with the AnyRAID, you swap out just the 4 terabyte for an 18 terabyte, and now you got a bunch more space. And then you swap out the next oldest drive for another newer drive. And you kind of just have this progressively getting newer hardware rather than having to do it all at once. And being able to get some of the benefit in the meantime can be very compelling.
Are we ever going to get any RAIDz 2?
Yes. The first phase of the project is with mirroring and getting the basic working AnyRAID into upstream. The pull request from that is probably just a couple of weeks away. The mirror version of this works. It's ready for review now. So the next part will be the RAID version, and it would support Z1, 2, and 3.
The other use case that I see that does not strike me as, the primrose path to heck, it has frequently bothered me that we can't just set a maximum stripe width on a VDEV, because there are so many folks who want to fill up 8 bays and want to have one VDEV, and it's like, this would perform so much better if you could have a 6 wide stripe on these 8 drives. I think that could be really useful. I think a lot of people would be better served by having an optimal width stripe on a less than optimal total number of drives, which is exactly what you could do with this.
Possibly. In general, I wouldn't expect AnyRAID to ever help with performance. It is always going to be a little different in that it's shuffling things out of the hood. So it's not that it's going to use more CPU or something. It's just that it's not going to light up every disk every time, whereas RAIDz does. But to Jim's point, maybe that in some very specific cases might help.
But when you're lighting up 6 of 8 drives, in ideal block widths with no padding going on and no extra bullshit, then you've got the more predictable, more stable, more ideal, larger individual IOP size with no padding that you would have with a 6 wide. You've just expanded that out across 8 drives. So I'm not saying there are a lot of cases where a 6 wide RAIDz 2 will outperform an 8 wide RAIDz 2. And I'm saying in those cases, and 8 drives in a 6 wide AnyRAID Z2 should outperform, in my opinion, in most cases, those same 8 drives in a suboptimal 8 wide RAIDz 2.
Yeah, there's just some caveats because in AnyRAID in particular, we attempt to be lazy and allocate the tiles as late as possible because we want the smaller disk to not be close to full when you add a bigger disk so that we can get more of the space of the bigger disk by being able to distribute the parity for the bigger disk across the remaining smaller drives. And so more than ZFS already does, it'll bias really hard to writing to the beginning of the drive and not filling any of the drives all the way at first. And so it may be leaving a little bit of the performance you would have got from regular ZFS on the table in order to make sure you get this extra flexibility for storage capacity. So I don't know how much faster it would actually be, but I just don't want to make any promises there.
I'll be very interested in empirical testing of precisely that, because it strikes me as potentially a rather good use case that is not just home hobbyist targeted.
In that case, it might at some point be worth having regular RAIDz let you control the stripe width. If it turns out that with this, you can prove that there's actually a performance advantage to it.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Allan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Tony has done. Tony writes, I've historically deployed UniFi access points at my customers and have had success. I've been approached by TP-Link, who is hoping to get my business. I've heard Allan and Jim talk about TP-Link. My question is, do they recommend switching? My reason for possibly switching is because they are cheaper, but more importantly, I have a local team to provide sales and technical support.
So the short version here is, if you are considering TP-Link access points, yes, I absolutely do still recommend them. I recommend them whether you're just looking at your own house or whether you are like Tony, someone who has clients who you set up Wi-Fi networks for. Either way, Tony's correct. They are very inexpensive, which honestly, I barely care about. Most of my deployments are only a handful of access points, and the cost per AP is really not a big factor. Nevertheless, TP-Link winds up what I want to select, over and over again, and it's partly because they have the highest performance out of any access points I've tested, including a bunch of enterprise-grade stuff. And I like the Omada controller. It's not as shiny looking as Ubiquiti's, which I consider a feature rather than a bug. It is very basic looking with all of the features and none of the faff. That's essentially it. The Omada controller will be very familiar, I think, if you're used to Ubiquiti's. mean, you're still just basically talking about, a single pane of glass controller. It can be run on software. You can either install it on some random machine, Windows or Linux, or you can set up, its own dedicated VM if you've got like a more professional hosting environment available and you want to do it dedicated. You also have the option of an inexpensive little hardware controller. Now, I think I've mentioned before on the show, I am not a fan of Ubiquiti's hardware controllers. The Dream machines, or whatever they're calling the newest ones, aren't as horrible as their initial Cloud Key was, but it's kind of hard to get my trust back after you put a whole bunch of devices out on the market and you say this is the best thing that you can do to control your network, and you set it up on non-journaling file systems with, power over Ethernet so that anybody can just reach up and unplug it out of your switch and immediately crash the non-journaling database on the non-journaling file system, and the odds of it rebooting again are slim to none. So TP-Link, they haven't given me that kind of a critical failure to get mad at and be slow to forgive yet. Their controllers, their little hardware controllers, the cheapest model is under $100, and it looks a lot like the old Netgear, little blue steel switches. It's just, it's an inexpensive but no fluff, no kidding around, metal cased device. And the first thing I did when I got one of those is just repeatedly power crash it over and over and over and over again. I think I must have done it 50 times in the space of an hour, and it never once had an issue firing right back up and doing exactly what it was supposed to do, which is what you're looking for in a cheap controller for a whole bunch of access points.
Yeah, the reason I went with the hardware controller, even though it was a bit more money than just putting it in a VM somewhere in my infrastructure, is especially for my home lab, I didn't want the Wi-Fi, which is kind of mission critical to the rest of the family, to be dependent on anything in the home lab. So having that little hardware controller that's off in the wiring closet running by itself just puts me in a much better position than doing the VM-based solution. So I've been very happy with the hardware controller.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. And do send in any ideas you have for what we should do for episode 256. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Allan Jude.
We'll see you next week.